My name is Eleanor Vance. For 7 years, I was the woman who kept the house quiet so my husband, Julian, could build the world. My mother-in-law called me a glorified decorator and told me my place was to ensure the napkins matched the curtains, not to calculate the structural load of a skyscraper. They treated my drafting table like a hobby and my blueprints like scrap paper. Julian stole my soul, line by line, until he thought he had enough to build his own throne. He thought I was just the shadow behind his light, but shadows are where the strongest foundations are poured, and I've spent the last decade ensuring that when his glass tower finally rises, I'll be the one holding the hammer to shatter it. The smell of lemon wax and expensive roast beef always felt like a suffocating blanket in our suburban mansion. I stood in the kitchen, smoothing out my apron, listening to the muffled roar of laughter coming from the dining room. Julian was hosting the senior partners of Sterling and Associates again. "Eleanor, the wine is breathing, but the guests are thirsty," Julian's voice boomed. It was the voice of a man who believed the world existed solely to provide him with an audience. I walked in, a bottle of vintage Bordeaux in hand. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun, a plain dress, the perfect supportive wife. Behind that mask, my brain was vibrating with the tension of a suspension bridge. "Here she is," Julian said, draping a heavy arm over my shoulder as I poured. "The heart of the home. I don't know how I'd manage the stress of the firm without her keeping the domestic gears greased. And she has such lovely little hobbies to keep her busy," his mother, Beatrice, added from the head of the table. She adjusted her pearls and gave me a look that suggested I was a particularly dull houseplant. "Julian tells me you spent all afternoon drawing those, what do you call them, geometric patterns?" "They're structural blueprints for the waterfront redevelopment, Beatrice," I said quietly, the wine bottle steady in my hand. The table went silent for a beat before erupting into chuckles. "Oh, Eleanor," Julian laughed, squeezing my shoulder just a little too hard. "Always so literal. It's adorable. She thinks because she took a few classes before we got married, she's the next Zaha Hadid. Don't mind her. She just gets a bit bored with the dusting." I retreated to the kitchen, the laughter following me like a physical blow. I sat at the kitchen island and opened my sketchbook. Hidden beneath a layer of grocery lists and recipes were the calculations for the Aegis Tower, my masterpiece. It was a revolutionary design using a self-supporting exoskeleton that would allow for unprecedented height with a fraction of the traditional steel. It was elegant, it was impossible, and it was mine. Julian had been struggling for months. His designs were derivative, stagnant, and the partners were starting to notice. He had become a man of meetings and martinis, having long ago forgotten how to actually create. Late that night, after the guests had stumbled out and Beatrice had retired to her wing to dream of social hierarchies, I found Julian in the study. He was staring at a blank CAD screen, a glass of scotch in his hand, and despair in his eyes. "The waterfront project is due in 3 days, he muttered, not looking at me. "If I don't present something that blows them away, Sterling is going to pass the lead to Miller. I'll be a junior associate again at 40. "I have the solution, Julian," I said, walking to the desk. I laid out my sketches. The Aegis. Look at the load distribution here. The exoskeleton takes the wind shear, allowing the core to remain flexible. It saves 20% on materials. He looked at the drawings. I saw the moment his eyes changed. The desperation flickered out, replaced by a cold, predatory light. He didn't see a gift from his wife. He saw a life raft. "It's complicated," he whispered. "You did this? Between the laundry and the gardening?" "I did this because I'm an architect, Julian, even if no one in this house acknowledges it." He didn't praise me. He didn't thank me. He spent the next 4 hours tracing my lines, asking me questions about the mathematics, absorbing my genius like a sponge. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed.
I went to the study and my drawings were gone. My hard drive, which contained the digital backups of the structural simulations, had been wiped clean. I found Julian in the driveway, putting his briefcase into the trunk of his Mercedes. He looked revitalized, wearing his most expensive suit. "Julian, my drawings, where are they?" He looked at me, and for the first time, the mask of the loving husband was gone. There was only the cold steel of a thief. "Eleanor, let's be realistic," he said, his voice smooth and terrifying. "If I present this as yours, the partners will laugh. They'll see it as a desperate man using his wife's craft project to save his skin. But if I present it as my evolution, we keep the house, we keep the lifestyle, we keep Beatrice in her pearls. Isn't that what you want, to be the woman behind a great man?" "You stole it," whispered I. "You stole years of my work." "You corrected it," he corrected, getting into the car. "Go inside, Eleanor. The gardener is coming at 10. Make sure he trims the hedges correctly. That's a job you can actually manage." He drove away, leaving me in a cloud of expensive exhaust. I stood there for a long time, the sun hitting the pavement, feeling the absolute silence of my life. I walked back into the house. Beatrice was in the kitchen, sipping tea. Julian seemed inspired this morning. I told him a good wife is like a good foundation, unseen, unheard, and content to be stepped on. I hope you aren't going to make a scene about whatever little help you gave him. I didn't make a scene. I went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with my clothes, and the one thing Julian had forgotten, my original hand-signed journals from university, which proved the conceptual origin of the Aegis design went back 10 years. I left the wedding ring on the marble vanity. "I'm not a foundation, Beatrice," I said to the empty room. "I'm the earthquake." I walked out of that house and didn't look back. I had no money, no job, and my husband had just stolen the only thing that could have launched my career. But Julian made one fatal mistake. He thought he had stolen the Aegis. He didn't realize he had only stolen a snapshot. He didn't have the soul of the building. He didn't have the revisions, and he certainly didn't have the patents I had quietly filed under my maiden name months ago, using the inheritance from my aunt. As I sat on the bus heading toward the city, I opened a new sketchbook. On the first page, I didn't draw a building. I drew a map of how I was going to buy every brick Julian tried to lay. 10 years, Julian. I'll give you 10 years to build my tower, and then I'll take the keys. The first year of my freedom was a brutal lesson in physics. I had gone from a mansion with a heated pool to a studio apartment in a district that smelled of wet pavement and cheap oil. I worked 3 jobs: a junior draftsman at a small engineering firm during the day, a freelance renderer for overseas developers in the evening, and a night shift clerk at a 24-hour pharmacy. My hands, once soft from gardening, were now permanently stained with ink and the gray dust of graphite. Julian had the house, the car, and the applause. I had a drafting table held up by bricks and a hunger that kept me awake at night. "Vance, these calculations for the mall expansion are perfect," my boss at the firm, a tired man named Arthur, said one afternoon. "You have a gift for seeing the stress points before they even exist. Why are you working here for $18 an hour?" "I'm building my own stress test, Arthur," I replied, not looking up from my screen. "I need to know exactly how much pressure a structure can take before it collapses." Arthur didn't know I was talking about my marriage. Meanwhile, the news was full of Julian. He had become the golden boy of Sterling and Associates. The waterfront redevelopment, based entirely on my Aegis design, had been approved by the city council. The media called him a visionary. They called the exoskeleton design the most significant leap in architectural thought since the invention of the steel frame. I watched his interviews on the tiny, flickering television in my apartment. He looked polished, charismatic, and utterly hollow. He spoke about his inspiration coming to him in a flash of late-night genius. He never mentioned the woman who had spent 7 years whispering that genius into his ear. Beatrice was there too, always in the background of the society pages, beaming at her son. One headline read, "Julian Vance, the architect who built a legacy alone." I didn't cry. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't send an angry email. Instead, I took the meager savings from my 3 jobs and began to execute the first phase of my plan. I founded a private investment group called Aegis Core. I used my maiden name, Eleanor Thorne, and operated through a series of offshore trusts I had studied during my night shifts. Step 1, the soil, I whispered to the empty room. I began to buy the land surrounding the waterfront project, small, neglected parcels, alleys, parking lots. Julian and the city council were so focused on the tower itself that they didn't notice the invisible buyer slowly encircling their crown jewel. By the 3rd year, Julian's tower began to rise. It was a beautiful sight, a skeleton of silver and light climbing toward the clouds. But I knew its secrets. I knew that Julian, in his arrogance, had ignored the secondary reinforcement phase I had outlined in the journals he never found. He thought the design was so strong it didn't need the redundant bracing. He was building a giant with a hidden weakness in its knees. Miss Thorne, Sarah, my first employee, a brilliant, disgraced accountant I had plucked from a bankruptcy court, said as she entered our tiny one-room office, the city has just announced the public-private partnership for Phase 2 of the waterfront. They need a heavy investor to provide the infrastructure links. Julian Vance is recommending a group called Global Heights. Buy them, Sarah, I said, looking at the architectural model on my desk. Excuse me? Don't just compete with them, buy the parent company of Global Heights. Use the dividends from our tech patents. I want Julian to think he's choosing his partners, when in fact, he's choosing my employees. You're surrounding him, Sarah realized, a slow smile spreading across her face. I'm giving him a cage made of his own ambition, I replied. He wants to be the king of the skyline? Fine, I'll just be the person who owns the ground the skyline stands on. By the 5th year, I was no longer a junior draftsman. I was the silent CEO of a multi-billion-dollar holding company. I had traded my apron for bespoke suits, but I still worked until 3 a.m. every night. Every night I would walk to the waterfront and look up at the Aegis. It was nearly finished. It was magnificent. It was the physical manifestation of my soul, and it bore the name of a fief. One evening, I saw Julian's car pull up to the construction site. He stepped out, followed by a younger woman, a PR assistant by the looks of it. He looked older, more stressed. The weight of maintaining a lie for 5 years was starting to show in the slump of his shoulders. He stood there, looking up at the tower, and for a split second, our eyes met across the street. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just a woman in an expensive coat waiting for a car. He saw a stranger, but I saw a man who had forgotten how to draw a straight line. 10 years, Julian, I said softly as my driver pulled up. We're halfway there. I had the patents, I had the land, I had the infrastructure, and most importantly, I had the original blueprints with the hidden flaws that only I could fix. Julian thought he was at the peak of his career. He didn't realize that the scaffolding he was standing on was owned by the woman he called just a decorator.
By the 6th year, the Aegis Tower had reached its 84th floor. It sat on the edge of the bay like a silver needle stitching the sea to the sky. From the outside, it was a triumph, but inside the structural core, the building was screaming. I sat in my high-rise office at Aegis Core, staring at the live vibration sensors I had covertly installed during the foundation pour years ago. The data didn't lie. Because Julian had bypassed the secondary bracing, the redundant reinforcements I had designed to counteract high-altitude harmonic resonance, the tower was developing a microscopic sway. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it was a structural cancer. "Miss Thorne," Sarah said, entering with a tablet, "we've just intercepted a panicked internal memo from Sterling and Associates. The chief engineer at the site is reporting unexplained structural groaning during the last windstorm. Julian is trying to suppress the report. He's telling the board it's just the building's settling." "He's out of his depth," I said, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. "He has the map, but he can't read the terrain. He doesn't understand that the exoskeleton isn't just for show. It's a living lung. If he doesn't install the tuned mass dampers I designed, that building will start shedding glass by the time it hits the 100th floor." "What's the move?" Sarah asked. "We wait for him to get desperate, and then we offer him a consultant." A week later, Julian Vance was standing in a boardroom, sweat beading on his forehead as the primary investors demanded answers about the strange vibrations felt by the crane operators. He was cornered. That's when Aegis Core made its first official move. We reached out through a shell agency, offering the services of a specialist in harmonic resonance. I didn't go myself. Not yet. I sent Arthur, my old boss from the engineering firm, who was now one of my top directors. "The meeting was interesting," Arthur told me that evening. "Julian Vance is a ghost of a man. He sat there while I explained the flaws in his design. He nodded like he understood, but I could see the terror in his eyes. He knows something is wrong, and he knows he doesn't know how to fix it." "Did he accept the partnership?" "He had no choice. Sterling and Associates is hemorrhaging money on repairs. We are now the official structural consultants for the Aegis. We officially own the air he breathes." While I was tightening the noose around his professional life, I decided to check on the domestic goddess who had helped destroy my past. I attended a charity gala under my maiden name, obscured by a designer mask and a gown of midnight silk. I saw Beatrice across the room. She was holding court, draped in diamonds that likely had been bought with the first bonus Julian received for the Aegis. She looked older, her face pulled tight by too many surgeries, her eyes still darting around the room to judge everyone's net worth. "It must be so wonderful," I heard a socialite say to her, "to have a son who is literally changing the face of the city." "Genius is a heavy burden," sighed Beatrice, her voice dripping with practiced martyrdom. "But Julian was always destined for greatness. I made sure he had no distractions. His first wife, poor thing, was such a weight around his neck. She had no vision, no class. Since she left, he's finally been able to fly." I stood 5 feet away, sipping champagne. I felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was quickly replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. They still thought I was the weight. They didn't realize that the only thing keeping Julian from crashing to the ground all those years was my hand holding the tether. "Step 2, the encirclement," I whispered as I walked past her, the scent of my expensive perfume the only trace of my presence. By the end of the 7th year, Aegis Core had successfully acquired the debt of Sterling and Associates. Julian's firm was now technically a subsidiary of my empire, though the paperwork was buried so deep in legal labyrinths that he had no idea who his new masters were. The tower was nearly topped out. The vibrations had been stabilized by the dampers my team installed, but those dampers were controlled by software that only I had the encryption keys for. Julian was being hailed as the architect of the century.
He was on the cover of every magazine. He was winning awards for a building he didn't understand, owned by a woman he thought he had erased. One night, I received a private investigator's report on Julian's personal life. He was drinking heavily. He was on his third assistant of the year. He was living in the mansion we once shared, but he had turned my old drafting room into a walk-in humidor. He was trying to bury the imposter syndrome under mountains of luxury. "He's ready, Sarah," I said, looking at the city skyline. The Aegis was glowing in the dark, a monument to my genius and his theft. "Ready for what?" Sarah asked. "For the opening gala. In 1 year, that building officially opens. The world's elite will be there. The cameras will be on him. He'll stand on that stage and prepare to take his final bow. And then I'll show him that a building without a soul is just a very tall tomb." I picked up a drafting pen, the same one I had used to sketch the first lines of the Aegis 10 years ago. I drew a single sharp line across the page. "The foundation is set, Julian," I said to the empty office. "The steel is in place. Now let's see how you handle the pressure of the crown."
By the beginning of the 8th year, the Aegis Tower stood at its full height of 1,002 feet. It was no longer just a building, it was a phenomenon. But while the world looked up at the glass and steel, I was looking down at the ledgers. Sterling and Associates was a hollow shell. Julian's lifestyle, combined with the massive cost overruns from the unexplained structural fixes, had pushed the firm to the edge of bankruptcy. "It's time, Sarah," I said, standing in our new headquarters, a sleek, minimalist office that occupied the top floor of the building directly across from the Aegis. "Call the creditors. Execute the buyback clauses. I want the final acquisition papers on my desk by Friday." "The board of Sterling is panicking," Sarah reported, a hint of a smile on her lips. "They know a mysterious entity has been buying up their debt, but they can't find the face behind Aegis Corp. Julian is telling them that a white knight investor is coming to save the legacy. He actually thinks someone is bailing him out because they admire his work. Let him believe that. Arrogance is a wonderful anesthetic." The acquisition was handled in the shadows of legal tunnels. By Friday afternoon, I signed the document that officially made me the owner of Sterling and Associates. I owned the desks, the computers, the brand name, and most importantly, I owned Julian Vance's employment contract. I was now his boss, his landlord, and his silent judge. But I kept the mask on. I issued a corporate directive through my lawyers. The new owner of the firm will remain anonymous until the grand opening of the Aegis Tower. All current management will remain in place to ensure a seamless transition. Julian was ecstatic. He sent out a memo to the entire firm, which I read from my tablet while sipping coffee, claiming that this new partnership is a testament to the global impact of our design. He even bought himself a new limited edition sports car to celebrate the rescue of his firm. I spent that weekend in my old drafting room, not the one in the mansion, but the professional studio I had built in my penthouse. I pulled out the original patents I had filed under the name Eleanor Thorne. I spent hours reviewing the stress loads and wind shear calculations for the opening night. The weather reports predicted a high-pressure system moving in from the Atlantic. The Aegis would be tested. The tuned mass dampers, the heart of the building, were functioning perfectly, but I had programmed a demonstration mode into the software. With a single command from my phone, I could make the tower sway just enough to be felt, or I could make it as still as a mountain. On Monday, Julian had to attend a mandatory owner's strategy meeting at a neutral location. He arrived at a private club looking every bit the celebrity architect. He sat at a long table flanked by his remaining partners, waiting for the white knight to appear. I didn't go. I sent a representative, a sharp young attorney named Marcus. "The owner is pleased with the progress," Marcus told the room as I listened through a hidden microphone. "However, the owner has noted some discrepancies in the original conceptual drawings. There are concerns that the structural integrity was borrowed from an earlier uncredited source."
I saw Julian flinch through the live video feed. He adjusted his tie, his face turning a shade paler. "I don't know what you're implying," Julian said, his voice straining for its usual confidence. "The Aegis is my signature work. Every line is mine." "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly. "The owner simply wants to ensure that when the ribbon is cut, there are no surprises. The owner will be present at the gala to receive the keys to the building personally." Julian left that meeting shaken. He went straight to a bar. My investigators followed him as he drank 4 double whiskeys in an hour. He was starting to feel the walls closing in, even if he couldn't see them yet. Meanwhile, Beatrice was busy planning the party of the century. She had taken over the gala committee, inviting royalty, tech moguls, and the city's elite. She was treating the Aegis like a monument to her own parenting. "My son has built a temple to human achievement," she told a reporter in a televised clip. "It's a pity his former wife isn't here to see it. She always lacked the imagination to understand what a man like Julian could achieve." I watched the clip and laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh anymore. It was the laugh of a predator watching its prey walk into a trap it had spent 8 years baiting. "Sarah," I called out, "send an invitation to the gala to every major architectural critic in Europe and Asia, and make sure the patent office sends an official representative for the Innovation Award segment." "Are we ready for the final reveal?" Sarah asked. "Not yet," I said, looking at the silver needle of the Aegis against the night sky. "First, I want Julian to have one more year of absolute blinding fame. I want him to be at the very highest point of his pride, because the higher the tower, the more spectacular the collapse." I picked up a piece of charcoal and sketched a final detail on a new plan. A memorial plaque for the lobby. It didn't have Julian's name on it. It had mine. 10 years, Julian. The countdown has begun.
The 9th year was a fever dream of international awards, champagne toasts, and flashing cameras. Julian had become more than an architect. He was a brand. He was invited to speak at Davos, his face was on the cover of Time, and the Aegis Tower was officially named the design of the decade by every major publication. To the world, he was a god. To me, he was a patient on a life support machine that I owned. "Miss Thorne," Sarah said, stepping into my office with a stack of glossy magazines, "Julian has just accepted the Global Visionary Award in Paris. In his speech, he claimed that the exoskeleton of the Aegis was a philosophy he developed during his lonely years of deep meditation. He's literally making up a mythology for your work." "Let him," I said, leaning back in my chair. "The more he lies, the deeper the hole he digs. If he had admitted he had help, he might have had a way out, but he's claiming sole authorship of every rivet and beam. He's making my legal case for me." I spent that year consolidating my shadow empire. Aegis Core had now absorbed not just Julian's firm, but the primary construction companies and the material suppliers involved in the tower. I had the entire supply chain in my pocket. If I decided to stop the elevators on opening night, they would stop. If I decided the lights should turn red, they would turn red. But my focus wasn't just on the building. I was watching the house, my old house. Julian and Beatrice had turned our former home into a shrine to Julian's success. They had demolished my garden to build a meditation pavilion and converted my old drafting studio into a trophy room. I watched through a hidden feed from a security firm I had recently acquired. I saw Beatrice hosting luncheons, showing off the sketches Julian had framed on the walls. They were my sketches, my original hand-drawn concepts for the foundation. Julian had framed them as his own, even keeping the coffee stain I accidentally made on one of them the night I stayed up to solve the vibration issues. "Look at the raw energy in these lines," Beatrice would tell her wealthy friends. "Julian always says he could feel the building breathing before it was even on paper. Such a contrast to his first wife, who couldn't even keep the flower beds straight." I sipped my tea and smiled.
The flower beds she mocked were the reason I knew exactly where the weak points in the suburban property's soil were, information I had used to buy the surrounding lots to prevent them from ever expanding. By the midpoint of the year, the pressure began to take its toll on Julian. The vibrations he thought were solved were actually being subtly manipulated by my software team. We were giving him ghost readings, phantom data that made him believe the building was failing during every minor windstorm. I watched a video of him in the middle of the night, alone in the executive suite of Sterling and Associates. He was staring at a structural monitor, his hands trembling. He was clutching a bottle of expensive scotch, trying to understand a design he had stolen but never truly learned. He looked like a man who was terrified that the world would find out he couldn't even solve a basic calculus problem without help. He called the consultant, Arthur. "It's swaying again, Arthur." Julian's voice was frantic over the intercepted line. "The sensors are hitting red in the north corner. What did you do to the dampers?" "The dampers are following your original specifications, Mr. Vance. Perhaps the original design didn't account for the unique thermal expansion of the Bay Area. You are the visionary, sir. Surely you have the answer." I'll look at the files," Julian stammered. But the files were encrypted, the backups were gone. He was a pilot in a cockpit where all the instruments were written in a language he didn't speak. 3 months before the gala, I made my move into the light. I began appearing at public events as the CEO of Aegis Corps. I didn't hide my face anymore, but I used enough makeup, a different hair color, and the weight of my new status to ensure I was unrecognizable to those who only ever saw me as a shadow. I attended a preliminary planning meeting for the gala. Julian was there, looking exhausted and bloated from stress. When I was introduced as the new majority owner of the parent company, he stood up and shook my hand. He looked into my eyes, and for a split second I saw a flicker of confusion in his expression. He felt a familiarity, a ghost of a memory, but he dismissed it. He couldn't imagine that the woman who now owned his life was the same woman he had discarded like trash. "It's an honor, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice oily with false charm. "I'm glad to finally meet our benefactor. I hope you're pleased with the masterpiece we've built for you." "Oh, I'm very pleased, Mr. Vance," I replied, my smile cold and sharp. "I've been watching the Aegis for a long time. It's exactly as I imagined it would be, every single line of it." "I look forward to showing you the view from the top at the gala," he said. "I look forward to showing you the view as well, Julian." I used his first name for the first time. He blinked, surprised by the intimacy, but before he could respond, Beatrice pushed her way through the crowd, her diamonds clinking. "And who is this lovely young woman?" Beatrice asked, looking me up and down with her usual predatory gaze. "This is Eleanor Thorne, Mother, the CEO of the group that saved the firm." "Thorne? That's a common name. You look familiar. Have we met at the club?" "I don't think so, Beatrice," I said, letting her see the glint of my earrings, the same ones Julian had borrowed from me years ago, which I had tracked down and bought back. "I'm usually much too busy building things to spend time at a club." As I walked away, I felt their eyes on my back. The trap was fully set. The tower was ready. The audience was invited. The 10th year was coming to a close. "Sarah," I said as I entered my car, "prepare the patent litigation files and make sure the press release for the opening night is ready, the one titled The Ghost in the Steel." The golden imposter had his crown. Now it was time to show him how much it weighed.
The final months leading up to the gala were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Aegis Tower was complete, but in the middle of the night, the building would sing. I had my engineers pulse the dampers in a specific harmonic frequency that created a low, haunting hum throughout the executive levels.
To Julian, it sounded like the ghost of his theft coming to claim him. "He's breaking, Eleanor," Arthur told me during our weekly briefing. "He came into my office yesterday with a folder of cash. He tried to bribe me to permanently erase the structural logs. He's terrified that the new owners, meaning you, will find out that the building doesn't match the original filed specs." "Did you take it?" I asked, looking at the city skyline. "I told him I'd consider it if he signed a document acknowledging that he was aware of the structural deviations. He signed it without even reading the fine print. He's so desperate to keep his Architect of the Century title that he's handing us the evidence on a silver platter." While Julian was drowning in paranoia, Beatrice was in her element. She had organized a pre-gala VIP tour for the most influential women in the country. I decided to join them, once again playing the role of the enigmatic CEO of Aegis Corps. We stood in the grand lobby, surrounded by white marble and the sound of a decorative waterfall. Beatrice was leading the tour, gesturing grandly at the soaring columns. "My son always said that a building should reach for the heavens while remaining rooted in tradition," she said, her voice echoing. "He designed this lobby to be a temple of light. He worked on these sketches for years, often locking himself away from the world to focus on his vision." I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the marble. "It's a beautiful sentiment, Beatrice, but I noticed something curious in the archives. The original concept for this lobby actually features a hidden structural seam, a signature of a different designer. It's almost as if the vision wasn't quite as lonely as you suggest." Beatrice's smile faltered. She looked at me, her eyes flashing with a familiar, icy coldness. "I don't know what archives you've been looking at, Miss Thorne, but my son's genius is singular. Perhaps you're confused by the administrative paperwork. Women in finance often struggle with the artistic nuances of architecture." The women in the tour group whispered. I simply smiled. "Artistic nuances are easy to fake, Beatrice. Engineering is not. If you look at that pillar over there," I pointed to the central column, "the way it meets the ceiling is a direct reference to the Thorne technique, a method developed by a woman who was forgotten by her firm 10 years ago. It's funny how genius always leaves a trail." Beatrice turned pale. She didn't know the Thorne technique, but she knew the name. She looked at me again, searching my face with a growing, horrified recognition. But before she could speak, Julian entered the lobby. He looked terrible. His eyes were sunken, and he was sweating despite the air conditioning. He saw me and tried to muster his usual charm, but it came out as a grimace. "Miss Thorne, I didn't know you were joining the tour," he said, stepping between me and his mother. "I wouldn't miss it, Julian. Your mother was just telling us how you locked yourself away to create this masterpiece. It sounds so exhausting, almost as exhausting as trying to remember where every line came from, right?" He froze. He looked at the column I had pointed to, and I saw the exact moment he realized I wasn't just an investor. He saw the way I held my head, the way I looked at the building, not with wonder, but with the familiarity of a mother looking at her child. "I need to speak with you," he whispered, gesturing toward his private office. "Alone." I followed him. As soon as the door closed, he turned on me. "Who are you, really? I've looked into your background. Thorne? You appear out of nowhere. Buy my firm? Buy my debt? What do you want? Is it money? Is it a partnership?" "I want what's mine, Julian." I walked to his desk and picked up a gold-plated pen. "You've spent 10 years living in a house built on my silence. You've let your mother mock me while you wore my brains as a suit. You think I'm here for a partnership?" He staggered back, the recognition finally hitting him like a physical blow. "Eleanor? No, that's impossible. Eleanor was... She was nothing. She was a housewife. She didn't have the resources. She didn't have the power. Eleanor was the architect, Julian. You were just the salesman, and unfortunately for you, the salesman just sold his soul to the person who holds the patent on his genius. I pulled a document from my bag, the original patent for the exoskeleton, filed under my maiden name, months before he stole the sketches. The ribbon cutting is in 3 days, I said, my voice as cold as the steel outside. You have 2 choices. You can stand on that stage and tell the truth, or I can tell it for you. But either way, by the time the sun rises after the gala, you will be exactly what you called me 10 years ago. Nothing. You can't do this, he gasped. The scandal. It will destroy the firm. It will destroy the building's value. I don't care about the firm, Julian. I bought it so I could set it on fire. And the building? The building is mine. It's my legacy, not yours. Your name on the plaque is just a typo I'm about to correct. I walked out of the office, leaving him collapsed in his expensive chair. As I passed Beatrice in the lobby, she grabbed my arm. Her hand was shaking. What did you say to him? What are you doing to my son? I leaned in, my voice a soft, lethal whisper. I'm just doing the gardening, Beatrice, trimming the weeds, just like you told me to.
The night before the grand opening was unnervingly still. The Aegis Tower stood like a silver ghost, its summit lost in the low-hanging clouds of a gathering storm. I sat in my penthouse, watching the blinking red light at the top of my creation. I wasn't celebrating. I was waiting. "He's at the tower," Sarah said, her voice crackling through the intercom. Security feeds showed Julian entered the building 20 minutes ago. He used his master override key. He's headed for the main server room on the 66th floor. "He's going to try to wipe the mass damper software," I said, a wave of cold pity washing over me. "He thinks if he deletes the evidence of the structural flaws, I won't have a smoking gun. He's willing to let the building become unstable just to save his reputation. Should we have the guards intervene?" "No," I replied, standing up. "Let him see exactly what he's trying to destroy. I'll meet him there." When I stepped out of the elevator on the 66th floor, the air was humming. The server room was a cavern of blue light and whirling fans. Julian was there, hunched over a terminal, his face illuminated by the flickering screen. He looked like a frantic ghost, his fingers fumbling over the keys. "It won't work, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. He jumped, nearly knocking over his flask of whiskey. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and full of a terrifying desperation. "Eleanor, I can fix this. I can recalibrate the system. I don't need your special software. I'm the architect. I can build a new patch." "You can't even write a basic line of code, Julian. You're trying to delete the only thing keeping this building from swaying 5 feet in the wind tomorrow. If you wipe that drive, you aren't just erasing my work. You're endangering 5,000 people who will be in that ballroom tomorrow night." "They won't know," he screamed, slamming his fist on the desk. "They'll see the lights, they'll see the champagne, and they'll see me. I deserve this. I spent 10 years being the face of this city while you were... Where were you? Hiding in the shadows, bitter and small?" "I wasn't hiding, Julian. I was building. I built a company. I built a fortune. And I built the very trap you're standing in right now. I let you have the fame because I knew you'd choke on it." I walked toward him, and he recoiled as if I were a physical threat. "The patents are already with the International Architectural Union. The board of Sterling and Associates has already received the documents of your embezzlement and the original blueprints.
This room, this building, it's already gone, Julian. You're just a squatter in a temple that belongs to me." He slumped against the server rack, the reality finally breaking through his delusion. "Why? Why didn't you just take half in the divorce? Why did you have to wait 10 years to ruin me?" "Because you didn't just take my money, Julian. You took my identity. You and Beatrice tried to convince me that I was a decorator, a housewife, a nothing. I didn't want a settlement. I wanted a total eclipse. I wanted you to reach the very top of the world so you could see exactly how far I had to climb to look down on you." The phone in his pocket buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Finally, he looked at the screen. "It's my mother," he whispered. "She's at the house. She says there are people there, men in suits. They're seizing the assets, Eleanor. The cars, the paintings, even her jewelry. I bought the debt on the mansion last month, Julian, and since you used the house as collateral for your latest investment, which was a shell company I also own, the foreclosure is immediate. Beatrice is being escorted to a very comfortable, very modest 2-bedroom apartment. It's exactly what she told me I deserved 10 years ago." Julian let out a broken, jagged laugh. He looked at the terminal one last time, then pushed it away. He knew he couldn't win. He knew the building was smarter than him. "What now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Are you going to have me arrested tonight?" "No," I replied, turning toward the elevator. "Tomorrow is the grand opening. You're going to put on your best suit. You're going to stand on that stage in front of the world. And then, Julian, you're going to introduce me." I left him there, surrounded by the blue light and the humming machinery. The storm finally broke as I reached the ground floor. Thunder shook the glass of the lobby, the glass I had designed, the glass that held firm. I looked up at the aegis glowing through the rain. It was beautiful. It was terrifying, and tomorrow it would finally speak its true name. 10 years, Julian, I whispered as I stepped into my car. The foundation is settled. The walls are up. Now, let's see the roof come down.
The night of the grand opening was a spectacle of blinding light and shivering crystal. The Aegis Tower was bathed in violet spotlights, its glass skin reflecting the diamonds of the city's elite who poured into the grand ballroom. This was the summit of high society, a room filled with people who believed that power was something you inherited or bought. They didn't realize they were standing inside a woman's mind. I stood in the wings of the stage, dressed in a gown of structured silver that looked like liquid mercury. I watched Julian through the curtain. He was on stage, under the burning heat of the spotlights. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, his skin sallow despite the expensive makeup, his hands clenching the podium as if it were a life raft. In the front row, Beatrice sat like a fallen queen. She was wearing her last remaining string of pearls, her eyes darting around the room, sensing the whispers. The news of the anonymous acquisition of Sterling and Associates had begun to leak, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of an impending scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice cracked, echoing through the speakers. The room went silent. 10 years ago, I began a journey. I told you that the Aegis was my vision. I told you that I built this skyline alone. He paused. He looked down at Beatrice, then at the sea of cameras. He looked like he wanted to run, but he saw Marcus and my security team standing at every exit. There was no escape. "But a building is only as strong as its foundation," Julian continued, his voice trembling. "And I have lived for a decade on a foundation of lies. I didn't design the Aegis. I didn't calculate its strength. I am not the architect of this century. I am merely a thief who stole the light from a sun I tried to extinguish." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Cameras flashed like a storm of lightning. Beatrice stood up, her face contorted in a mask of horror, but Julian didn't look at her. "The true architect of the Aegis, the owner of the firm, the holder of the patents, and the woman who built the empire that now owns my life, is here tonight. It is my honor, and my deepest shame, to introduce the real Eleanor Thorne." I stepped out from the shadows. The silence was absolute. I walked to the center of the stage, the light hitting my silver gown until I seemed to glow. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Julian. I saw the man who called me a decorator, the man who burned my dreams to warm his own ego. He looked small. He looked finished. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice amplified and steady, carrying the weight of 10 years of silence. "You're right. A building without a soul is just a tomb, and today we exhume the truth." I turned to the audience. "My name is Eleanor Thorne. 10 years ago, the blueprints for this tower were stolen from my drafting table. Today, I have reclaimed them, but I didn't just come back for a building. I came back to prove that you can take a woman's work, you can take her home, and you can take her name, but you cannot take her genius." I pulled a small remote from my pocket. "To celebrate the true opening of the Aegis, I would like to show you its heartbeat." I pressed the button. Outside, the violet lights shifted to a brilliant, piercing white. The software I had written began its final sequence. The massive tuned dampers at the summit began to pulse, and the entire building let out a low, resonant chord, a perfect musical note that vibrated through the floorboards and into the bones of every guest. It was the song of a structure that was finally at peace with its creator. As of tonight, Sterling and Associates is dissolved. It will be rebranded as Thorne Architectural Group. Julian Vance is no longer an architect. His license has been revoked by the board. And as for the ownership of this tower, I looked directly at Beatrice, who was clutching her throat. I've decided that the Aegis will no longer be a playground for the elite. The top 20 floors will be converted into a tuition-free university for women in STEM and architecture. We will build the next generation of designers in the very place where one was almost erased. The room erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a riot of sound. Journalists scrambled to the stage, but I didn't stay for the questions. I walked past Julian, who was still standing at the podium, staring into the void of his ruined career. "The hedges are trimmed, Julian," I whispered as I passed him. I walked out of the ballroom and into the private elevator. I pressed the button for the 100th floor, the observation deck. When the doors opened, I was alone in the clouds. The wind was howling against the glass, but the building was as still as a mountain. I walked to the edge and looked down at the city. The lights stretched out like a map of 1,000 possibilities. I opened my sketchbook, the one I had carried through the pharmacy shifts and the lonely nights in the studio. On the last page, I didn't draw a building. I wrote a single sentence. I am the one who builds. I felt a presence behind me. It was Sarah. She was holding a phone. "The press is going wild, Eleanor. The stock for Thorne Group is soaring. And your mother-in-law is outside. She's demanding to see you. She says she's family." I looked at the glass, seeing my reflection. The architect, the CEO, the survivor. "Tell her I don't have a mother-in-law, Sarah. Tell her the owner of the building is busy looking at the future. And then have her escorted to the sidewalk. It's public property. She can look up at my tower from there." I turned back to the view. The 10 years were over. The debt was paid. The foundation was solid. The sky was finally mine.